Hi everyone, welcome to this ISO 9001 Risk Workshop for Process Owners. The purpose of the session is to provide you with an understanding of our quality management system risk management approach and give you the knowledge to identify quality control points and to determine risk. In a separate session, we'll show you how to put those risks onto the Resolve risk module and how to progress any risk control measures. What we're going to cover in this session is to look at single points of process failure, where we can implement quality controls or risk controls, the quality risk scheme that we have adopted within Knight Frank, some risk examples from the real world, and finally, the next steps that you will need to take after this session. Whether you are manufacturing a product or providing a service, there are opportunities within the process for failure to occur, which can result in dissatisfaction for the customer or cost to the business from having to do the work twice. In quality terms, we often call these failures defects or non-conformances. In this next section, we are going to discuss these failure points, including how we need to assess them for risk and put into place preventive measures. For a service provider such as ourselves, there are three high goals of the process that contribute to the delivery of the service. The first one is to create value to the customer, which leads to customer satisfaction. If we do not create value for them, it will lead to dissatisfaction and complaints. Having to return a product under warranty, not getting their rent collected on time, or issues with the budget do not create value for the customer. Customers do measure value in different ways, especially when there are several contacts at different levels within the customer organization. However, that's a discussion for another time. The second, but no less important to a business, is that the service delivery creates value for our business. We can go beyond customer requirements and provide the wow factor, but it will be at an extra cost to the business, which often the customer does not pay for. If the customer is going to be happy without the wow, or if they're not paying for the wow, then we need to aim to meet their expectation as far as it does not conflict with the value creation for our business. I'm sure we would all consider a Ferrari to be a quality car, but when we are looking to buy one, we would not expect to be paying the same price as a Holden or a Ford. The last goal is that our service delivery process needs to be efficient. Processes that are not efficient add to business costs and often mean more resources are required to operate them. The reason for discussing these high-level process goals is that we need to keep these in mind when looking for single points of failure within the service delivery process. As we mentioned in our ISO 9001 awareness sessions, a process in its simplest form consists of steps which take inputs and converts them into an output. A simple example of this is making a cup of tea. As our inputs, we take water, milk, and tea. We go through the steps of boiling the water, putting the tea and water into a pot, letting it brew, and then placing the milk and brewed tea into the cup. The output from this process is our hot cup of tea. At any point in the process, there is the opportunity for a failure to occur. We call these points a single point of failure, as a single point can cause the process not to create value for the customer or the business, and maybe not be an efficient process. Single points of failure can occur with both the inputs and the process activity steps. The first action in our quality risk assessment process is to identify where these single points of failure can occur. A single point of failure typically has one of 4 modes of failure. And I will talk about human error last, and it's the most common and the most complex. Supplier errors can occur with the inputs they provide to our process, such as them being delivered late, being delivered in an erratic way, early one week, late another week, have poor quality, i.e. they come damaged. Incomplete, cost more than we originally agreed and budgeted for, or unplanned events can cause disruption to the supplier, such as we saw during the pandemic. Technology failure points can occur in equipment we use for processing or error glitches in the software used. Data or information failure can include incorrect data being provided or information being out of date. Human error can occur due to a number of underlying causes. They can be split between errors and violations. Errors can be skill-based errors, such as slips of actions, e.g. not carrying out actions as planned. Lapses of memory, e.g. we lose our place in a task or even forget what we had intended to do. And finally, rule-based mistakes, e.g. our behaviour is based on remembered rules or familiar procedures, even when these are not the most convenient or efficient for the task, such as following the procedures from a previous employer. Violations, such as routine violations, e.g. where rule breaking or procedure has become a normal way of working within the group. Situational violations, e.g. breaking a rule due to pressure to get the job done. And finally, exceptional violations, which rarely happen, e.g. to solve a new problem, you feel you need to break a rule, even though you're aware that you will be taking a risk. For each of the human failures, there are proven preventive measures that can be used. Having identified our single points of failure and understanding the failure mode, we are ready to undertake the risk assessment process. Risk assessment is simply looking at the likelihood that the failure mode will occur and the effect or consequence of the failure. Within the quality management system, there are specific proven risk tools that we could use which fall within Lean Six Sigma methodologies. However, we have opted to use a more simplified method that aligns with our health and safety and environmental approach. We simply rate the likelihood and consequence using a risk scheme and compare this to the risk appetite to determine if we need to implement risk treatment. There are 2 things we need to note in this approach. Once we determine the risk, we need to consider if the risk is as low as it can get, or in risk terms, ALARP, which stands for as low as reasonably predictable. The second thing we need to note is that risk mitigation measures fall within 2 camps. The first being an action, which is a single event, e.g. we buy a new piece of equipment, or a control, which is ongoing repeated activity, such as putting in an additional approval level or a payment. In this next section, we shall look at the quality risk scheme that we have adopted for the Knight Frank QMS. Now, risk can be looked at using many lenses, which can provide a different perspective on the risk. For example, we can look at it from a health and safety lens, an environmental lens, financial lens, reputational lens. In fact, Knight Frank has briefly developed a consequence rating for each of these different lenses. Our quality risk map matrix is a traditional 5x5 and it's replicated within the Resolve application. So we simply identify the rating for consequence and how likely the event will happen, and then pick the corresponding risk level on the matrix. When looking at consequence, we need to consider the consequence to the customer and also the consequence to our business. And as we said earlier, the consequence to value creation for the customer and also the consequence of value creation for our business, and whether that it will cause the process to be inefficient or not. As I mentioned, we are purely looking at the risk with quality in mind, considering the three process goals of customer value creation, business value creation, and efficiency. For example, a failure mode, which would only have a temporary effect on the performance of the process, will have little effect on the three process goals and will not cause much disruption to the process, would be considered to be of a minor consequence. The likelihood of a failure mode occurring is consistent across all risk lenses, and therefore the same rating scale used in health and safety applies. Likelihood can be determined on how likely the event will occur or the probability in a 1-year horizon. I would not get too hung up on which one is used, as they both will produce the same result. Knight Frank's risk appetite can change over time, depending upon how risk averse we are. This will be reviewed in line with customer complaints, internal or external audit findings, and market information. Understanding what is acceptable today may not be tomorrow. Generally, if we identify high risk, we need to implement more risk controls to bring the risk down. There may be circumstances where the business wants to accept the risk outside the appetite, such as taking the risk to pursue a business opportunity. For instance, we've all come across the salesperson who sells a service or a product that has not been quite developed or finalised, but needs to make the sale to stop the client looking elsewhere. Medium risks will also need further treatment unless it is as low as reasonably predictable. What this means is that if we were to put in control to lower the risk further, the cost of doing so to the business would be disproportionate to the actual risk. For example, to eliminate the risk of someone entering information into uppercase instead of lowercase, we had to spend $500,000 on a software upgrade, then it wouldn't be proportional. So hopefully these previous sections, you'll understand that what we are trying to do. We are simply trying to identify single points in the process or inputs where we could fail, understand the mode of failure, identify the magnitude of the risk, assess the need for risk mitigation, and where relevant, put in place risk control measures and actions. Lastly, we have to review our risks if there has been any changes or if there are new emerging risks, especially where we have made changes in the process or the client has made changes to its requirements. Now, I just want to go back to our tea analogy, just to give you an example of this, and then we'll talk around some real life examples. So we said earlier, in making a cup of tea, we have ordered some tea bags, milk, sugar, and these have been delivered to us, to our cafe that we're running. Now, our single point of failure is on the tea bags being delivered, we've identified that some tea bags occasionally have splits in them, which is resulting in the tea leaves floating in the tea, which customers are not happy with. So we've assessed the risk of this, and we've identified the likelihood of this happening is possible. We've seen it happen a few times, and the consequence is a free, it's a moderate. We are getting a few complaints from customers around tea leaves floating in their tea. So overall, using our matrix, we've decided the risk is medium. And as it's a medium risk, we look at whether there is anything further that we can do. So in this particular instance, we've identified that we could switch to loose leaf tea and start using a teapot, which contains a self-contained strainer. And that will eliminate the need to use the tea bags in the first place. Now, after our tea bags are delivered, we store our materials in a damp storeroom. And the single point of failure that we've identified is that the sugar's starting to become damp and clogs together. And the likelihood of this happening is almost certain, that the storeroom's damp. And the consequence, we've identified that the consequence has been a 2. We're saying it's minor. We've had a few customers complain that because they can't put a precise number of teaspoons into their tea, that it's being sweeter than they would normally like it. So our risk we've identified using the matrix is a medium. But again, our control that we've decided to implement is to purchase an airtight plastic container to store the sugar in, help stop the damp air getting to the sugar and prevent it from going damp in the first place. When we start our process, we boil the water and then we place the tea bags in the teapot. But we suddenly started to get some complaints from customers that the tea's a bit weak that they're getting. So we've identified the single point of failure as insufficient tea brewing time. And again, we've identified this is a possible likelihood, like got a 3. And we've identified that it's a moderate consequence. We are getting some customers moan about this issue. And so the corresponding risk level is a high risk. So to get over this issue, we've purchased a timer to ensure sufficient brew time for the tea and established a minimum time it should sit in the teapot before it's served to the customer. So as you can see from this simple example, and I'm sure we've all made a cup of tea at some point, it's just about identifying where things can go wrong, looking at the risk in terms of those value creation requirements, and then deciding on what controls can we put in place. Is it a control to eliminate a single point of value failure, or to control it, reduce the likelihood? So it's important that you can all relate what we've gone through to some real life examples, and we will look at a couple of examples where it's been managed well, and one example where risk management was so poor that it destroyed one of the major American companies. And some of these will be household names to you. So I'm sure we're all familiar with Starbucks coffee chain. Well, Starbucks sourced coffee beans across the world and started to see that their business was at risk from fluctuations in supply due to weather and political disruptions. To address this point of failure, they decided to implement a diverse sourcing strategy where they ceased reliance on one supplier from each region, and they now use multiple suppliers. And this is an example of good risk management. So high likelihood, high consequence. If they haven't got coffee beans, they can't supply. Yeah. We all became familiar with Zoom during the pandemic, and I'm sure not many of us had heard of them before the pandemic. During the pandemic, Zoom suddenly experienced unprecedented growth in the use of their platform, which unfortunately highlighted the vulnerability of their infrastructure to cope with additional traffic and security issues. A great opportunity for them to grow, but it just highlighted the risks that they had. To combat the identified point of For failure, Zoom invested in additional infrastructure and it implemented end-to-end encryption. Again, an example of good risk management. We cannot talk about real-life examples without considering an example of poor risk management. Kodak was once the largest provider of film, cameras, and processing facilities in the world. They had the biggest share of the market and employed thousands of people across multiple countries. During the late 70s, Kodak's technical team invented the first digital camera. However, Kodak felt that this new technology would cannibalize their existing sales of film and related services. So they shelved the technology and did nothing to consider the risks of others developing the same technology. Their competitors took a different view and embraced and pursued the technology alongside their existing film sales. The end result was that Kodak's business was eventually destroyed. They do exist today in the US, but only employ 100 or so people, serving a few hobby enthusiasts. Now, the next actions that we want everyone to take is to examine your process as defined on the SIPOC, assess the risk of single points of failure, identify the native risk, and that's the native risk is the risk without any controls being applied. List your current controls and identify the residual risk, and the residual risk being the risk taking into account the risk controls that you've implemented. We want you to enter this into the Resolve Risk module, and as I said, there will be an accompanying session on how to use that module. Our advice is try to keep these risks to the minimum to ensure customer satisfaction. So that's really the focus around those value creation. Typically, we've experienced with other processes, 4 seems to be the maximum risk that are being identified. We want you to identify if they're not ALARP and identify further controls and assign improvement actions via the corrective action module of Resolve. We want you to review the risk and progress the risk to review completed, and we'll show you how to review the risk when we go through the how the Resolve platform works. Okay, thank you for listening to this session. Please engage with the session on how to use the Resolve application for the risk module, and together, hopefully, these will give you both idea of what we're trying to do. One of the areas I probably didn't sufficiently cover is in terms of risk controls. And risk controls can be, we're either eliminating the risk, it can be administrative controls that we're putting in place, such as a policy, procedure, some training for the staff who are operating that process. Or it may be that there's an additional workflow that's put into a process where someone else needs to provide an approval level or confirm something in the system before you progress. If you need any more information around how this process works, etc., then please, by all means, reach out to me. Thank you.